Hey there, this is the story of how England dominated the world and stole its treasures. There's a room in London, a quiet room, marble floors, high ceilings, soft light filtering through tall windows. And in that room sits a sculpture, ancient, beautiful, carved 2,500 years ago by hands that never imagined it would end up here. It's Greek, from the Parthenon in Athens, one of the most sacred sites in human history. But it's not in Greece, it's in London, in the British Museum. And if you ask the Greeks for it back, the British will tell you no. Not because they bought it fairly, not because it was a gift, but because in 1816, a British lord named Elgin took a chisel, climbed onto the Parthenon, and cut pieces of it off while Greece was occupied, while they couldn't say no, and then he shipped those pieces to England, sold them to the British government, and they've been there ever since. Here's what almost nobody tells you. This wasn't an accident. This was the system, to explain something that changes how you see the world. For nearly 300 years, England didn't just build an empire, it built a machine designed to extract, to take, to accumulate, not just land, not just resources, but culture, history, identity. They took the treasures of entire civilizations and brought them back to London, and they called it preservation. They called it protection. They called it for the good of humanity. But here's the truth. It was theft, on a scale the world had never seen. Now, you might be thinking, every empire did this. Rome did it, Spain did it, France did it, and you're right. But England perfected it. They didn't just conquer, they curated. They didn't just take treasures. They built museums to display them. They didn't just steal history. They rewrote it so that they were the heroes. And here's the brilliant part. They convinced the world that they were doing everyone a favor. Think about it like this. Imagine someone breaks into your home, takes your family heirlooms, your grandmother's jewelry, the painting your great-grandfather made, and then they put it all in their living room and say, "Don't worry, I'm keeping it safe. You couldn't take care of it properly anyway, and now everyone can see it. You should be grateful." That's what England did to Egypt, to India, to Greece, to China, to Nigeria, to Iraq, to dozens of countries, for hundreds of years. And here's where it gets interesting. Most people think empires are built with armies, with guns and ships and soldiers. And yes, England had all of that, but the real power, the real dominance, it came from controlling the story. Let me show you how this worked. In the late 1700s, England was already a colonial power. They had territories, trade routes, wealth flowing in from across the globe. But they had a problem. France was the center of culture. Paris was where art, philosophy, and refinement lived. And England was seen as functional, practical, a nation of merchants and sailors, not a nation of culture. So England decided to change that. They began collecting, not just buying art, not just commissioning sculptures, but taking the cultural heritage of the nations they conquered. They took Egyptian obelisks, Indian diamonds, Greek statues, African masks, Chinese porcelain, and they brought it all back to London. Pay attention to this. In 1753, England opened the British Museum, the first public museum of its kind in the world, and they filled it with treasures from across the empire. But here's the genius of it. They framed it as education. They said, "We're preserving history. We're making it accessible to everyone. We're protecting these artifacts from destruction." And the world believed them, because who's going to argue with a museum? Who's going to say that education and preservation are bad things? But let's be very clear about what was really happening. England was building cultural legitimacy on the back of stolen goods. They were saying to the world, "Look at us. Look at what we have. Look at how civilized we are. We have Greek philosophy, Egyptian history, Indian wealth, Chinese art. We are the guardians of human civilization." And because they controlled the objects, they controlled the narrative. Here's something almost nobody realizes. Owning another culture's treasures is a form of dominance. It's not just about the objects themselves. It's about what those objects represent. When you take the Parthenon Marbles from Greece, you're not just taking stone, you're taking Greece's connection to its own history. You're saying, your heritage is in our hands now, and if you want to see it, you have to come to us. It's a reminder, a constant visual reminder of who has power and who doesn't. Now, here's the part that gets uncomfortable. This system didn't end with the British Empire. It's still happening. Right now, today, the British Museum holds over 8 million objects, many of them taken during colonial rule, many of them demanded back by their countries of origin. And the British response? No, not "we'll consider it," not "let's have a conversation," Just no, because returning the objects would mean admitting what they really were, stolen. Let me ask you something. Have you ever been to the British Museum, or the Louvre in Paris, or the Metropolitan Museum in New York? These are incredible places, breathtaking. You can see the entire span of human history in a single afternoon. But here's what they don't tell you on the plaques. How it all got there. They'll tell you the date, the civilization, the artistic style. But they won't tell you, we took this during a war. We took this while the country was under occupation. We took this because we could. And here's the interesting part. England didn't just steal treasures. They stole the right to define what those treasures meant. When Greek statues are in London, English scholars study them. English historians interpret them. English narratives are built around them. Greece doesn't get to control its own story anymore. Egypt doesn't get to decide how its history is told. India doesn't get to reclaim the symbols of its identity because the objects are in England, and with them, the power to write history. But this is only the beginning, because the real story of how they built this system runs even deeper. Let's go deeper, because what I'm about to tell you is where 90% of people get it wrong. They think England's dominance was about military might, about superior technology, better ships, stronger armies. And yes, those things mattered. But here's the truth. England's real power came from something much more subtle. It came from debt. Let me explain how this works. In the 1600s and 1700s, England wasn't the wealthiest nation in Europe. France was richer, Spain had more gold, the Dutch controlled key trade routes, but England had something the others didn't. The Bank of England. Founded in 1694, it was one of the first central banks in the world, and it allowed England to do something revolutionary: borrow money, at scale, at low interest rates. They could finance wars, build fleets, fund expeditions, all on credit. And when you can borrow money more cheaply than your enemies, you can outlast them. You can fight longer wars, build bigger navies, expand faster. Pay attention to this. England didn't have more wealth than other empires. They had more access to wealth. And access is more powerful than possession, because possession can be taken, spent, lost. But access is a system, a structure, a machine that keeps running. Now, here's where it connects to the stolen treasures. When England conquered a territory, let's say India, they didn't just take the land, they took the resources, the gold, the diamonds, the textiles, and they used those resources to back their financial system, to secure more loans, to fund more expansion. The wealth of India didn't stay in India. It flowed to London, and in London, it became capital. Capital that could be invested, multiplied, turned into more power. Here's something almost nobody talks about. The British Museum is a financial statement. Every object in that building represents wealth extracted from somewhere else. Egyptian gold, Indian jewels, African art, Greek marble. It's not just culture, it's collateral. It's proof of England's reach, its dominance, its capacity to take and hold. And that proof attracts more investment, more trust, more power. Let me show you a specific example. In 1799, French soldiers in Egypt discovered the Rosetta Stone, a massive granite slab covered in 3 scripts: Greek, Demotic, and hieroglyphics. It was the key to decoding ancient Egyptian language, one of the most important archaeological finds in history. But here's what happened next. The British defeated the French in Egypt, and as part of the treaty, they took the Rosetta Stone. Not because they found it, not because they earned it, but because they won. And they brought it back to London, put it in the British Museum, and suddenly England became the centre of Egyptology. Think about what that means. For centuries, Europeans couldn't read hieroglyphics. Ancient Egypt was a mystery. But once the Rosetta Stone was decoded in London by British scholars, England controlled the narrative. They decided what ancient Egypt meant, how it should be understood, what lessons humanity should learn from it. Egypt itself had no say, because the key to their own history was in a British museum. Here's where 90% of people misunderstand the system. They think museums are neutral, educational, for the public good. But museums are never neutral. Museums are power. They decide what gets displayed, what gets hidden, whose history matters. And when your country's history is in someone else's museum, you lose control of your own story. Now, let's talk about something even more uncomfortable. England didn't just take objects. They took people, living people, indigenous people, colonized people, and they put them on display. In the late 1800s and early 1900s, England and other European nations ran human zoos. They would bring people from Africa, Asia, the Pacific Islands, and display them in parks and exhibitions, like animals, like curiosities. They called it anthropology. They called it education, but it was dehumanization, pure and simple. And here's the kicker. Those same institutions, those museums, those universities still hold hold the power today. They still have the objects, they still control the narrative. And when countries ask for their heritage back, the British response is, we're protecting it. You can't be trusted to care for it properly, as if the countries that created these treasures somehow forgot how to protect them. As if 2,000 years of Egyptian civilization needs British supervision. It's paternalism, wrapped in scholarship. Let me tell you what this really is. It's a self-reinforcing system. England took the treasures. The treasures brought prestige. Prestige brought scholars. Scholars created institutions. Institutions trained more scholars. And those scholars defend the system because their careers depend on it. Here's something that will make you think. That's Woollerstocks. That's scholars. If you're an Egyptologist, where do you go to study? London, Oxford, Cambridge, because that's where the objects are. If you're a Greek archaeologist, where do you publish? In British journals, in British institutions, because that's where the legitimacy is. So even today, long after the empire has ended, England still controls the intellectual framework. They still decide what matters, what's worth studying, what version of history gets told. And here's the genius of it. They don't need an army anymore. They don't need to occupy countries or rule colonies, because they control the cultural infrastructure, the museums, the universities, the archives. That's the empire that never ended. If videos like this help you see how power really works, how history is written and rewritten, feel free to subscribe, because the next part is something almost nobody ever hears. Now we're going to talk about something most people never connect to empire, but once you see it, everything clicks. I'm talking about identity, not just England's identity, but the identity of every nation they conquered. Because here's the truth, when you lose your treasures, you lose part of yourself. Let me explain. Imagine you're Greek. You grow up hearing stories about the Parthenon, about how your ancestors built one of the most beautiful structures in human history, about how it stood for democracy, philosophy, art, everything that made ancient Greece remarkable. And then you go to see it. You stand in Athens, looking up at the Parthenon, but something's missing. The sculptures, the friezes, the pieces that made it complete. They're not there. They're in London. And if you want to see them, the heritage of your ancestors, you have to get on a plane, fly to another country, and ask permission to enter a British museum. How does that feel? Like you're a guest in your own history, like your heritage doesn't belong to you anymore. And that feeling? That's the psychology of empire. Here's what most people don't understand. Empires don't just conquer land. They don't just extract resources. They colonize the mind. They make you believe that you're inferior, that your culture isn't valuable unless they validate it, that your history doesn't matter unless they preserve it. And over time, you start to internalize that. You start to believe it. Let me give you an example. In India, the British didn't just take physical treasures, though they took plenty, the Koh-i-Noor diamond, gold, textiles, art, but they also took something more insidious. They rewrote Indian history. British scholars studied ancient India. They translated texts. They catalogued artifacts. And in doing so, they created a version of Indian history through a British lens. They decided what was important, what was civilized, what was worth remembering, and they taught that version to Indians, in British schools, in British universities. So even after India gained independence, many Indians still saw their own history through British eyes. This is where 90% of people get stuck. They think cultural theft is about the objects, the statues, the paintings, the gold, but it's not. It's about control. Control over how people see themselves. Control over what they believe their ancestors were capable of. Control over whether they feel pride or shame in their own heritage. Pay attention to this next part. When England took the Benin Bronzes from Nigeria in 1897, they didn't just take art, they took proof. Proof that West Africa had a sophisticated civilization, that they were skilled metalworkers, artists, traders, that they were advanced. But if that art is sitting in a British museum, labelled and interpreted by British curators, the narrative changes. It becomes, look what we discovered, look what we preserved, not, look what they created. Here's the thing about stolen treasures. They become evidence of the thief's sophistication, not the victim's. When tourists walk through the British Museum, they don't think, wow, Nigeria was incredibly advanced. They think, wow, the British Museum has an incredible collection. The credit shifts, the power shifts, the identity shifts. Now, let's talk about something even deeper, the trauma of losing your heritage, because this isn't just intellectual, it's emotional. When your culture's treasures are taken, it's not like losing money or land. It's like losing your memory, like someone took the photo albums from your childhood and said, we'll keep these. You can visit them if you want, but they're ours now. And here's what nobody talks. That Trauma gets passed down. Generation after generation grows up, knowing that their heritage is somewhere else, that their identity is locked behind glass in a foreign country, and they internalize that loss. They start to believe that their culture isn't valuable, isn't theirs, that it belongs to the colonizers now. Let me show you how insidious this is. In many former British colonies, there's a phenomenon called colonial hangover. It's when people still idealize British culture, British accents, British education, even decades after independence. Why? Because the colonial system taught them that British was better, that British was more refined, more educated, more civilized. And part of that teaching came from the museums, from seeing their own culture only when it was curated by the British. Here's something almost nobody realizes. The British Museum doesn't just display objects, it displays hierarchy. It says, we have the world's treasures. That makes us the center of the world. It reinforces the idea, consciously or not, that British culture is superior. Because if British culture weren't superior, why would all these treasures be in Britain? It's circular logic, but it works. Now, let's talk about what happens when countries ask for their treasures back, because this is where the system reveals itself. When Greece asks for the Parthenon Marbles, Britain says, we're keeping them safe. Greece can't protect them. When Nigeria asks for the Benin Bronzes, Britain says, they're part of world heritage now. They belong to everyone. When Egypt asks for the Rosetta Stone, Britain says, it's in the public interest to keep them here, where everyone can see them. But here's the truth behind those arguments. They're still saying the same thing the empire always said. We know better than you. You can't be trusted. We're doing this for your own good. It's colonialism, just dressed in different language. And here's the genius and the cruelty of it. The British Museum is protected by law. The British Museum Act of 1963 makes it illegal for the museum to return objects from its collection. So even if the museum wanted to give things back, and many curators do, they legally can't. The empire built a legal wall around its stolen treasures and called it heritage protection. Let me tell you what this really is. It's structural theft. The system isn't just corrupt individuals. It's not just greedy collectors or unethical archaeologists. It's a structure, a legal, institutional, cultural structure designed to hold on to what was taken and to make it seem justified. Here's something that will make you uncomfortable. When you visit the British Museum or the Louvre or the Met, you're participating in that structure, not because you're a bad person, not because you support theft, but because the system makes it easy to see these treasures without questioning where they came from. The plaques don't say stolen, they say acquired, as if that's a neutral word. And here's what happens psychologically. When you see something beautiful in a museum, you associate that beauty with the museum. You think, I'm so glad this museum preserved this. Not, I wonder who this was stolen from. Because the framing shapes your perception, and the framing is always controlled by the institution. Now, let's talk about what empire does to the colonizer, because this isn't just about the victims, it warps the identity of the conqueror too. When England built its identity around stolen treasures, it built a false foundation. It told itself, we are great because we have these things, not, we are great because of what we create. It's borrowed greatness, reflected glory. And when your identity is built on something you took, not something you made, it's fragile. It requires constant defense, constant justification, constant denial. Here's the tragedy. England could have been proud of what it actually created. Its literature, its science, its engineering, Shakespeare, Newton, Brunel. But instead, it tied its identity to what it took. And now, centuries later, it can't let go. Because letting go would mean admitting the foundation was rotten. And here's what nobody wants to say out loud. Returning the treasures would destabilize British identity. Not financially, not practically, but psychologically. Because for centuries, Britain has told itself and the world that it's the guardian of civilization, and if it returns the treasures, that story collapses. It becomes just another country, not the empire, not the center of the world, just England. Let me ask you something. If all the stolen treasures were returned tomorrow, what would be left in the British Museum? British history, British artifacts, a much smaller museum, a much quieter story, and maybe that's what scares them. Not the logistics of returning objects, but the loss of the myth. Here's the truth. Empires don't just fall, they're dismantled. And one of the final pieces to dismantle is the cultural claim. The idea that the empire had the right to take what it took. And as long as the treasures remain in London, that claim remains. And now that you understand this, the next step changes everything. Alright, let's bring this home. Because now that you understand how England built its dominance, not just through armies, but through debt, cultural control, and stolen identity, the question becomes, what happens next? here's what most people don't realize. The story isn't over. Right now, all over the world, countries are pushing back, not with military force, not with economic sanctions, but with demands for restitution. Greece wants the Parthenon Marbles back. Nigeria wants the Benin Bronzes, Egypt wants the Rosetta Stone, India wants the Koh-i-Noor diamond, and every year the pressure grows. And here's what's changing. For the first time in centuries, the narrative is shifting. People are starting to ask, wait, why does the British Museum have all of this? Who gave them the right to decide where these treasures belong? And why should we keep defending a system built on colonial theft? Pay attention to this. In 2022, Germany returned the Benin Bronzes to Nigeria. Not all of them, but hundreds. It was a massive symbolic shift, because if Germany, another colonial power, can return stolen art, why can't Britain? And that question is now impossible to ignore. Here's what's happening behind the scenes. Museums are terrified, not of losing the objects themselves, but of what returning them would mean. If they return the Parthenon marbles, what about everything else? If they admit that those were stolen, they have to admit that most of their collection was stolen. And once that admission is made, the entire moral foundation of the institution crumbles. So they're stuck. Stuck defending a system they know is indefensible. Stuck repeating arguments that sound increasingly hollow. We're protecting them. They belong to humanity. The public has a right to see them. But those arguments don't hold up anymore, because the countries asking for their treasures back aren't war-torn. They're not unstable. They're building world-class museums, hiring top curators, creating infrastructure. The excuse of "we're protecting them" doesn't work when Greece has a state-of-the-art museum waiting for the marbles. Here's the truth. This is about power, and power doesn't surrender easily. Returning the treasures would mean acknowledging that the empire was built on theft, that British greatness was partly borrowed, stolen, taken by force, and that's a hard pill to swallow, not just for the institutions, but for the people who've grown up believing the myth. Now, let me tell you what's going to happen. Slowly, painfully, some objects will be returned, not because Britain suddenly develops a conscience, but because the cost of holding on will become too high. The reputational damage, the diplomatic tension, the moral inconsistency. Eventually, it will be easier to return them than to keep defending the indefensible. But here's what you need to understand. Even when objects are returned, the damage is already done. Generations grew up without access to their own heritage. Scholars built careers studying objects that should never have been in their institutions. Narratives were written from a colonizer's perspective and taught as universal truth. You can return a statue, but you can't undo centuries of psychological colonization. And here's the part that almost nobody talks about. England isn't the only one. France has the same problem. The Louvre is full of stolen art. The United States has the same problem. The Met is full of looted antiquities. Belgium, the Netherlands, Spain, they all have the same collections of colonial plunder. This isn't unique to England, but England perfected it, and England is the one still refusing to let go. Let me ask you something. What would it mean if these treasures were returned? Not just practically, but symbolically. It would mean that the age of empire is truly over, that the West can no longer claim moral authority based on what it took, that the narrative of civilizing the world is dead. And maybe that's the real resistance, not to losing the objects, but to losing the story. Here's what I want you to take away from this. History is never neutral. Every museum, every textbook, every monument is telling a story, and the people with the power decide what that story is. For centuries, England had that power. They took the objects, they wrote the history, they controlled the narrative. But that's changing, slowly, painfully, but it's changing. And when you walk into a museum now, any museum, I want you to ask, where did this come from? Who decided it should be here? Whose story is being told, and whose is being erased? Because once you start asking those questions, you can't unsee the system. Here's the final truth. The greatest theft wasn't the objects themselves, it was the theft of the right to tell your own story. When your heritage is in someone else's museum, they control how you're remembered. They control what the world thinks of you. They control whether your civilization is seen as great or primitive. That's the real power, and that's what countries are fighting to reclaim. So, the next time someone tells you it's just about museums, it's not that deep. You'll know better. You'll know that museums are never just museums. They're monuments to power, and power always has a cost. Take a breath. You're seeing the world differently now. If this helped you understand how empire really worked and how it still echoes today, I'd be grateful if you subscribe. I make videos like this because I believe that when you understand history, you understand the present. And remember, the treasures may be in glass cases, but the fight for them is still happening. Right now, you're not just watching history, you're part of it,